Welcome. This is Craig Applegath, and this is the 21st Century Imperative podcast, the podcast series that explores the insights and approaches of scientists, designers, planners, engineers, business entrepreneurs, and other successful change makers who are finding effective ways to meet the three critical challenges posed by the 21st Century Imperative. These are: how will we continue to live on our planet without destroying our biosphere? How will we repair and regenerate the environmental damage we have already caused? And how will we adapt to the escalating impacts of climate change? Each episode will feature an interview with an individual whom I think you will find not only inspiring, but also very relevant, helping you answer the question, what can I do to meet the challenges of the 21st Century Imperative? In this episode, I have the very great pleasure of interviewing Stan Choptiany, former high school teacher, university professor, and mayor of St. Andrews, New Brunswick. I first met Stan in the classroom many years ago. He was my high school biology teacher, and I was lucky enough to have him for all 4 years of high school. Stan was absolutely the most inspiring teacher I ever encountered, and I credit him with inspiring my lifelong passion for biology, ecology, and the scientific method. Stan started his career as a biologist and biology teacher, where he taught science in several Ontario communities, finishing his teaching career as a lecturing professor with Laurentian University. Stan's second career was in public policy and public service. Moving from Ontario to the community of St. Andrews, New Brunswick, Stan served on various public boards before being elected as a municipal councillor and then mayor of St. Andrews. In these roles, Stan was able to provide important leadership for many social and environmental issues, most notably his innovative work on climate change and the impact on St. Andrews of its associated sea level rise. In 2012, Stan was awarded the Queen's Jubilee Medal in recognition of his leadership in serving the community in both New Brunswick and Ontario. In our interview, I'll be talking with Stan about his experience confronting climate change in both his role as the mayor of the oceanfront town of St. Andrews and in his role as a biologist and environmental activist on the front lines of environmental harm reduction, regeneration, and climate adaptation, and what advice he would have for someone setting out to make a difference in meeting the challenges of the 21st Century Imperative. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Stan, thanks so much for taking the time to do this podcast interview today. And thanks for taking the time to show me around St. Andrews before we did the interview. It was a great tour and good to get a sense of the community that you were mayor of and are still so involved in. Why don't we start with you telling listeners about how you ended up as the mayor of St. Andrews, New Brunswick, after having spent most of your career as a biology teacher and professor, and why did you make the transition from academia to politics?
It's an interesting question because you often try to think of, well, how did you get here in this particular moment in life, and what choices did you make that ended up moving you in that direction? And when I think about this, it's a case of really coming from my parents. They had a really strong sense of social justice, and that motivated them in their life, and I think they passed it on to us, and I'm hoping I'm passing it on to our children. So when I look back, even though when I taught, the school system is full of injustices in terms of how it treats kids or students, it's how it meets their needs, and even early on, I can remember reading a book early on about teaching as a subversive activity. And what you looked at was that you're trying to meet the needs of people. And sometimes education does a fantastic job with it, but other times it does a poor job for certain people. So I had that sense even in my career, and my career expanded eventually from being a classroom teacher to going into administration, to running a private school, to working in alternate schools, to being a principal and vice principal, and then finished my career as a university professor. All of that was a personal journey around what is the best way to provide an environment that the science that I love, because that's what I taught, has an opportunity to be accepted and utilized by the people that I worked with over those years. But along the way, there was an awful lot of social involvement. So I think I was involved with the United Way in Barrie, Ontario for 8 years. And I looked at and became exposed to a segment of society that I became involved and cared about very much in terms of how they helped one another. I was on the board of directors for the Women and Children's Crisis Center. And that was a period of time of intense learning about a segment of society that is still not well treated. And it's not just the abuse, but it's what society does with the women who are abused and the families of children that are connected to those women and what happens to them afterwards. We don't do a great job with that. So that sense of social involvement, social caring came through a lot of my volunteer work. And then it turns out you mesh those things together and you develop a caring about your community and a connection to your community. So when I had the opportunity to run as a councillor, it was in a by-election, I didn't really know what I was getting into. But as soon as I sat on council, I thought, wow, there's a two-edged sword here. There was an incredible opportunity to do things, but there was also a system that was awful. It was dysfunctional in so many different ways.
Do you mean the municipal politics system, or just referring to the actual community here?
Actual community here, yeah. and the nature of some of the people who were involved in it. And they were they resisted change. They had a lot of personal agendas, and it was not a good environment. At the same time, almost immediately, I got on council in May of 2010, and the summer of 2010, we had a drought. It was a very hot summer, and our drinking water source, as I referred to before, in our personal conversations, had algal blooms and cyanobacteria blooms, which had the potential of releasing mycotoxin and poison in our whole drinking water source. And I had an academic problem given to me, and it was exciting because all of a sudden, all of the knowledge base that I had over teaching environment and understanding systems was there as a living classroom experiment, if you like, except now it's real.
Right.
It can affect the people that are in our town. So it was a science experiment that became revealed, and it was very exciting because it meant that I could be first of all, an investigator at the front line, and then an agent of change of how we looked at that. And then
which is not the typical opportunity for biologists.
No.
They get to understand the problem, but have no real impact on the solution.
Exactly. And it was a very personal impact because it meant mobilizing both the government as well as the departments within the government and the local people, as well as your connection to the town public works, because they're involved with water. So we had to analyze what have we got and what's happening and how do we respond to it, to the case where we actually developed evacuation policies for the whole town or procedures. We took a look at importing bottled water for the whole town, and we have an economic generator, the Algonquin Hotel, which is it's like we talk about, it's our mill. It's our industry that...
Tourist mill.
Yeah, exactly. So what could we do? And then in the fall of that year, we had a storm on November 5th that was a combination of the right wind directions, the high peak tide, and a full moon cycle, that we had major flooding and major damage through a nor'easter, which flooded the town and exposed then this whole question of vulnerability around climate change and sea level rise. So within a very short period of time, we were faced with environmental issues that, again, as I say, a two-edged sword. One side was scary, but the second side was I was in a position to actually affect change. But it was a journey, and still is a journey, of what are you going to do? And what that allowed me to do was to change my relationships with the councillors I had, with the mayor that wasn't affected that way. And it also stimulated me to realize that if I had the chance of running for mayor, which was a careful decision, then I could affect more change and do more things than I could as a councillor. So that really was a marvelous opportunity. But in some ways, it was no different than my decision to go into administration in the high school system and the traditional high school system, because it was a thought that I could be more effectual in effecting change as a leader than as a person who was criticizing, complaining, acting against, protesting, all those kinds of things, subverting. So where I think there's lots and lots of room for questions, there's also lots and lots of room for being in positions that could affect positive change. And that's really been a rewarding process throughout my life. And I've had great privileges in terms of not only working within social groups, but rising to decision-making positions, which allowed us to affect change more directly.
It's clear that maybe in future all municipal councillors, in fact all politicians, should have a background in biology and geography in order to understand a world that's being changed by climate change. You step into the role, you bring lots of great experience given what's happening in your community, as it turns out, perfect timing. What about getting understanding and buy-in from the community? Because they've been living here forever, you're sort of from outside. What were some of the opportunities and challenges for getting that kind of understanding for what was happening?
Well, it goes back to the old concept when you're teaching. If you tell the people, they learn a little bit. If you let them do it, they actually learn it. And that pushes you into a direction of engagement. So one of the things that I did consciously in a variety of ways was to start involving the public in the decision-making process as well as the advocacy process. So, for instance, one of the early things that we did, we had a Chamber of Commerce that had 19 people in it, and they were into some real difficult and even legal situations. And within a pretty short period of time, about 8 months, we changed the membership from that small number to well over 100. But that meant that there were now 100 people who were economic drivers of the community who were working together on a variety of issues. And there were lots of issues. And of course, climate change became one of them. So as we then worked with that group of now 100 key economic drivers, you could start shaping the responses of many of them. And you had allies. So when we developed the questions around the cyanobacteria in the water, we worked with a group of not just St. Andrews people, but we had a group of 35 working members who had a vested interest. Either they were aquaculture, freshwater aquaculture people who were using the water from Shamcook Lake, which now was under threat, the biological station, which was using water from there, or the Huntsman Marine Science Center, the Department of Environment that's thinking, holy smokes, here we have a whole town that may not be able to drink water, and now we're finding the same cyanobacteria in other lakes, and there may be other communities at risk. So you were able to mobilize and work with people. So what became quite effective was that rather than isolating your municipal government, it became participatory. I think some of the successes that we had as a period of time when we worked in government, and that wasn't easy because there's a huge amount of resistance, and a lot of it was from within, was listening to people who had the historic understanding of what your community is and the connections. And when you're in small communities, people know each other and they know their strengths, but it's rare that they're asked. Mm-hmm. And that fundamental change in changing your outlook as just a mayor to a facilitator in certain aspects was very helpful to me and very helpful, I think, to the community. At the same time, when you're a mayor, you're drawn into other levels of government and you're drawn into contacts with people in a way that opens doors if you do things correctly.
What kinds of strategies and tactics did you and your community develop for adapting to the impacts of climate change?
The strategies are continuing, and it's really, at this point, it's a 6 or 7 year journey of fact-finding and trying to fine-tune what our knowledge base is and how climate change will affect us specifically in St. Andrews. And the thing that's neat about climate change, and I think the thing that's neat about science, is sort of two levels. To me, science is almost like a really good mystery book. There's a whole bunch of clues, and you're working to find out who did it. And in climate change, we've got a lot of the clues understood, and we think we know what's going to happen. But science is neat because it will give us the answer, and it may not exactly be the answer that today we think of. So it's a moving target. And that kind of excites me, because if it was cut and dried, black and white, it's easy to make the answers, but it's not. it affects us in so many different ways, in ways that we have to keep learning. So that strategy is at first one of learning. So for instance, we, as you've seen it when you've been here, we have a deer issue, but that is also a tick issue. But the issue that really is a concern is that Lyme disease has moved up from the middle states in the United States to where Lyme disease in St. Andrews is now a real issue.
Yeah.
It wasn't 5 years ago. That's climate change.
And actually across Canada now.
Yeah.
Southern Canada.
And so you start finding out that climate change isn't one thing. It's not just sea level rise. It's not just the intensity and duration and frequency of storms. It's a whole basket of changes that are going to be, in some cases, threats and vulnerabilities to how your community reacts. So that first stage in terms of a strategy is really the learning part. The other part, the tactic still is a combination of sharing knowledge of where we are at this point in time and what we know, and then engagement. And it's been a wonderful, exciting process to listen to people who are in their 90s now, which we have, and they can tell you how it's changed in St. Andrews. They can tell you the things that they're seeing and the frequency of what they're doing. So they understand climate change, and they can tell you about when diseases appeared or didn't appear, or when the water levels were different, or when they had the storms, or how they've had to react under different environmental conditions. And they know it, they just don't call it climate change. And then you put those two things together, and that historic knowledge. And that other thing, I mentioned trust earlier. Many of these people who are 90 have the trust of the community. So the guy from Ontario, even though I've been here, we've been coming here for 37 years, I'm still from away.
Yes. Yeah.
Lila Hahn's been here for 94 years. Lila Hahn they listen to. She's neat. I mean, at 94, she still wears high heels, which is kind of impressive. And she's good on them, too. But that community trust level is interesting. So when we talked a little bit about engagement, it's also knowing who are your community champions, who are your strengths of people who are your motivators, your people who can move ideas and actions along further than you can.
In her book, Willful Blindness, Margaret Heffernan explores our almost infinite capacity to deceive ourselves, to believe what we want to believe, no matter how it is at odds with reality. Did you ever find that willful blindness issue something that was a pushback to the community understanding or wanting to be able to address climate change issues?
Sure, because people often look very specifically at themselves and how am I affected. And the thing about climate change is it's a process that's going to happen. It doesn't pick and choose people. Yet there are people, there's a lady in town whose property is at the lowest point in the town. It's actually below sea level. And when we get storms, it floods. And she has issues on top of that. And she will not look at her circumstance as anything other than it's your fault that these things are happening to it. And so they will look at people who are in positions of authority, or people in politics, or people who are decision makers, and they won't look at why it's happening. They'll only look, it's happening to me, and you're the person who is the direct route for where my upset and where my anger is going to be directed. They feel trapped. And that's not an unusual situation. And lots of us become overwhelmed by emotion, by depression, by unfair acts of God, if you like, in terms of how all of a sudden things affect them.
One of the really big problems with climate change is that it's so insidiously slow. Although over a 5-year time, you said you were seeing the results, but it's sort of like that old biology analogy of boiling the frog, that if you put a frog in hot water, it jumps out really quickly. But if you put it in cold water and slowly heat it up, it doesn't sense it's being cooked. And I sometimes wonder if that's not what we're all suffering. We can't see it. It's too slow. Is that something that you found here, or when you were talking to constituents and talking at a provincial level?
The thing that we're seeing about climate change is, for up until about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was the heating slowly, and the frog was just getting warm, and the bubble bath was not bad. But we've had a series of spike incidents. So I used that example of 2010, seeing the first cyanobacteria algal blooms. All of a sudden, that's dramatic.
Yeah, when you threaten people with taking their water supply away from them, people perk up.
It's huge. We had a storm in 2010, but we had an ice storm in 2013. We also had one in 1997, I think it was here, that was dramatic, and people were out of power for 11 days. Here, the ice storm in Christmas of 2013, we were out of power for approximately 5 to 6 days, although people in the surrounding areas were out almost as much as 2 weeks. And then that summer of 2014, we had a Hurricane Arthur that came through, and we don't get hurricanes through here. It's rare. And that devastated the town, and we lost power even longer in town. We were 5 and 6 days without power. It wasn't as hard because it was warm. You had no power, so a lot of people got generators. In the wintertime of the ice storm, it was hard. We were out of the house for 5 days. So those incidents of climate change-related flooding, if you go to the next town over St. George, we've had 2 or 3 incidences where the Macadavic River and the Digdawash have flooded. Now we're seeing the spikes. Now we're seeing where you're dropping the frog into the boiling water, and the reactions are there. And it's not just one thing, it's a whole group of things. So I've mentioned right now the increase of Lyme disease, the number of people who are getting ticks is all of a sudden dramatic. So you hit a community with 5 or 6 things within a 5 or 6 or 10 year period, and all of a sudden climate change becomes, it's here, it's real.
And people are connecting the dots. One of the weird things now is when you see the news on television or hear it on the radio, they'll talk about a storm or they'll talk about the water problem, but they won't link it to the bigger picture. It will just be a weird incident that's being reported. Are enough of these things happening now here that were people starting to get it? This is climate change. We have to start to think about it.
They are. Yeah. And so you get a tick.
Yeah.
And you're scared. And the neighbor across the street had one last week. He's scared. I mean, he got it off. He took it to the doctor. They're sending it away for tests, and he's waiting. And he got the hopefully preventative dose of early antibiotics. But now it's like a ticking clock. Right. Is the rash going to appear? Is he going to? Likewise, are you waiting for that storm that's going to flood Patrick Street? And it's going to come. When does it come? So people are understanding. And the nice part is that they're beginning to internalize.
It sounds like you've been very effective engaging the community in a discussion about what climate change is and some of the key strategies that the community is going to have to engage in to deal with it. What were some of the most effective tools you used for public engagement? What kind of advice would you offer to other mayors or councillors looking to engage their community?
The key part, and we've got a lot of that already done, is understanding what the specifics are based on our knowledge right now. So if we look at sea level rise, and if you're a coastal community, what's the impact? If you're not a coastal community, what's the predicted impact for the increase in frequency and intensity of storms? How is the flooding going to be? Where are you in your floodplain? What properties are going to be affected? So learning the specifics is a starting point. The next part is how do you disseminate that knowledge in a way that's participatory, that you're not just, it's not gloom and doom and scare tactics. It becomes that participatory part. And then the 2 specific things that I look at was the engagement of groups of people within the town and listening to their stories and listening to what they have to say. And they are almost always your best agents of change, because when they get a chance to tell their story, they've internalized their story. They can tell you what they've seen. They can tell you as a kid what their experience is and now how it's different now. And you can't do that. You can tell them stories, but it's not as good as them telling you a story. But the other things are, and we had talked a little bit about this, we did a simple exercise across the street in the park where we had the data and the contours of where things will flood based on our LiDAR mapping. And what we did was have a large group of people and gave them spray cans, and I had it sort of staked out, and they drew the lines from one stake to the next stake.
Was spray cans paint?
A paint.
Yeah.
And it was water-soluble, non-toxic, et cetera, that will disappear in the next rain. It's mostly surveying tape, paint that you can use. And we drew the contours of, I think we picked a 2055 contact. So it's far enough in the future that the change is dramatic, so you can certainly see where the water is going to come. But it was close enough that people can think, well, that's 40 years out, and I can relate to and understand 40 years. It's far, but it's understandable. And then you stand back and you look at, people are always interesting because they look at what they've done as part of that contour, and then they look collectively at where their neighbor is, and then they follow, and many of them are walking the line and looking around and saying, well, how will this actually change this landscape if now, twice a day, every high tide, this is going to be water?
So the engagement process actually provided a good foundation for building strategy and policy on.
Yeah, and then you keep building with that. And the thing that is, in some ways it's worrisome, but it's also a natural part of the process that you don't quite understand. As a teacher, when you teach, say, a grade 9 science lesson, and if you teach for a long time like I did, I thought, this is the 33rd time that I've taught this lesson. Why don't they get it? And then you realize, hang on here, they're new kids. It's their first time. So there will be people who will be the first time that they're a counselor, or the first time that they're a new employee, or there will be the first time that they come onto this material and they need to learn it. So you don't just teach it once, you have to keep it alive, and you have to keep informing people. There's lots of people who got out of grade 9. They don't need that lesson again, but there's lots of people who need to hear it for the first time. So that's a part that's very important to be able to continue the dialogue. And as I mentioned before, the thing that's exciting about the science is that the dialogue will change. So our data is based on estimates of sea level rise, roughly spring of 2015. It's 2 years old, which is not bad. But I'm guessing when it's 5 years old or 7 years old or even 10 years old, it's going to be different. And we have to keep up with that change in knowledge base of what we do locally.
What were some of the specific strategies or tactics that came out of this that are now being applied in the community that will help the community adapt to the impacts of climate change over the next 20 to 50 years?
Operationally, we've dramatically changed the way the town does its budgeting and its asset management. So what we've been able to do in that 4 years that I was mayor was we were able to develop an inventory, first of all, of what we had. And that seems funny that you think, well, surely you know where your pipes are and where the sewers run. And we had, for the most part, we did. But we had some pretty nasty surprises. We did smoke tests for the whole town, for instance, around you put smoke into the storm sewer line, which is only supposed to carry water, and then you look at the house and it's going up their sanitary smoke sack or gas stack. So that meant that, hang on here, your sewer, when you flush that toilet, is going into the storm drain. That's not good because that goes out to the bay. It doesn't go into the sewage treatment plant.
But it also means if there's a flooding, that it's going to come back up through their septic into their house.
You got it. So we were getting basements flooding and not understanding why, because we didn't understand that there were incorrect connections. So simple things like that, we had a lot of work to do. And then the second part of that was developing the condition reports of what condition is each key resource. Because again, it's very interesting when you're in politics. You think you're going to do all these things as a mayor, and you find out legally the thing that's most important is when someone turns their tap on, will the water come out and can you drink it? And when they flush their toilet, does it go where you want it to go? And that's your legal, legislated responsibility. So anything else you do is on top of that. But even when you do your budgeting has to reflect what you're being able to provide key services. The tie to climate change is that climate change impacts all of those key water, sanitary, road subservice, stormwater, those 5 key services that are mandated for a town. Now you can add fire and you can add police on top of that as key services, and then there's more on top of that. Although we don't have dedicated healthcare here, we have to go to the next town for the hospital. Each one of those things will have climate change component, and it's learning what that climate change component will be, identifying it, and then finding out what the effect will be, what's your vulnerability, and then the key part within a town is understanding how that affects your budget and then doing your asset management budgeting based on sound science in terms of, is it best to wait 5 years to dig up a road because some of your other stuff is still in pretty good condition and is not impacted, and try to do it at once? Or do you move the clock ahead? How will climate change, and do it all at once to finish that thought, but how will your climate change affect the life cycle of different materials and different parts of what you do? How do you budget and look long term? And then, it's all connected, because from a town standpoint, that translates into what's your tax rate?
Right.
What can you afford to do? What is your responsibility? What's the provincial responsibility? What is the federal responsibility? Who will help you? When I had presentations and talks yesterday, we were identifying for the town, if we move ahead to 2025, which is not that far ahead, 8 years, we're looking at an infrastructure deficit of around $24 million in terms of being able to maintain and renew those 5 things: the water, the roads, the sewer, the sanitary. We can't do that. Our budget, essentially the money we can put into that in that 8-year period, is around $3.2 million. If we did all of that, so 3.2 is what we can afford, 24 million is what we need. So there's questions to ask in terms of help in government and policies.
And of course, this is happening across the country.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, what advice would you offer to other mayors of coastal communities from what you've learned here?
It's a tricky one, because when you ask a question like that, you think, well, I'm the guru, I'm the guy that has all the knowledge, and I'm not. I'm a person who had a certain skill set, who was in a position with some unique
other than learning biology before they become mayor.
But part of that is, and it's becoming aware and knowledgeable, and that's a shared situation. And I think one of the things that's been very positive out of the government of New Brunswick, and it doesn't matter which party is in charge, it's been lovely that we have a civil service that understands this thing. So what we're beginning to see in this government is that there are mandating standards that require municipalities to start looking at climate change for their funding, for their impacts, for how they work, and it's becoming law. So if you're a new mayor or a new councillor in a community, you're required to do it. So it's not just a case of you happen to be the right person, the right time with the right training.
What do you think the best roles for the public sector versus the private sector in reducing environmental harm and adapting to climate change are? Like, what's the balance between the two?
It's forming the dialogue between the two. And again, if I talk locally, we have in this area, we probably have maybe 5 or 6 key employers. They're fairly large employers, and they're international employers. What's nice about them, and if I take the aquaculture industry for an example, and in our area it's run by, it's essentially a family business. It's Cook's Aquaculture, but they have over a number of years bought out other ones. So there's numbers of other names that are associated with aquaculture. And there was a period of time where their practices were certainly suspect, and they weren't necessarily doing the best thing. But it was to be kind, I'll say it was a learning curve. But what they've realized, certainly in the last 5 or 7 years, is that climate change impacts what they do. And what they do impacts the local people. And happily, if I use cooks as an example, there's a real sense of responsibility to local community. And their operational practices have shown that there are connections. And they listen and they look at how we can work together. Certainly their bottom line is affected by climate change. So if the water is too warm, the fish don't prosper. You need cool water to raise salmon offshore. If the water's too warm, you get different ectoparasites or different diseases that change. There's very direct correlation between the climate change impacts and bottom line in terms of your corporate thing. So that level of understanding is very good. And if we look at forest products within this New Brunswick community, that understanding is there because it's a direct result of climate change. The changes they're seeing affects the forest. So it's quite real. And because of that, there's been some pretty positive collaboration between how things are being done. It's not perfect, but it's real.
The role for government, either carrots or sticks, and providing a framework for understanding and action, that still has an important role, does it not, in how we're going to address both the impacts and pulling back on the damage we're already doing?
Absolutely. But we're at that period, and it's a very interesting period of time in the Canadian history in that you still have a fossil fuel industry that has unbelievable influence in government, and the government still subsidizes the fossil fuel industry to an extraordinary amount. In billions of dollars of public money goes into that. And yet we realize in climate change that fossil fuels are not the answer, and fossil fuels are part of the problem. A main part of the problem is CO2 production or methane production. So when you talk about locally, again, if I bring it back to New Brunswick, we talk about the Canada East pipeline. Does it make sense to be putting millions and millions of both public money and private money into a pipeline to extend fossil fuel use, not for Canada, but to ship it offshore? Because that's what's going to happen. There's no benefit, I think. Well, although they do talk about there may be 55 jobs for New Brunswick long term. So it's strategies and pressures, and you also have an infrastructure that is in its dying years and dying gasp that still has influence. So it's going to take the 10 or 15 or 20 years for that fossil fuel industry to run its course. So you have a government then that, is it going to be a visionary government? And is it going to look out 20 years ahead to say, when fossil fuels are no longer tenable as your economic base? And the sad part is that 20 years from now, the government's also going to have all of the fossil fuel legacy of abandoned drill holes, of tar sands to deal with, of pipelines, and et cetera. And we're going to be on the hook for that, no matter what anyone says to the different. So if you're a government right now, in 2017, you're pushed in different directions. And they're powerful people who are resisting. But if you have a visionary government, wouldn't that be incredibly exciting to take a look at and say, where will Canada be in 20 years, in 25 years, in 50 years, around meeting all of the challenges that climate change will bring? And part of it is how you run your economy. Part of it is how you change the key resources that you have and how you access them. And resources can be, again, we have a boreal forest which will move north. We have a food basket. We have a variety of shoreline that could be used for aquaculture. There's all kinds of potential. It will have to be run on non-fossil fuel energy sources. So how do you look at that? And there are already examples that you're well aware of, and it's part of your daily life, of examples in other places that they're meeting those needs, whether it's greenhouses on buildings in Montreal or whether it's solar communities in Europe. There's all kinds of potential. And then, if we want to start that whole conversation, we're not Canada in isolation. We will be affected by climate change refugees, the environmental refugees. How do we as a country look forward to changing the very basic fabric of who we are and incorporate the changes that we expect in the country to be able to meet that need? So, and the exciting part can be, wow, we can be at the forefront and the leaders of this, or we can be dragged kicking and screaming. It'll be a very interesting period of time.
Even though it's too late to pull back from the climate change that we've already created, do you think we're going to be able to adapt to its impacts across the country? I mean, do we have the resources now to meet those impacts? You've already started to put forward strategies in your community and adopt those strategies. Is it something that across Canada you see us being able to do over the next 10 years? Because that's the real crunch time.
I hate to say it, but no. I don't think that we're going to have the resources. We're going to have the crisis. So I talked to you about, locally we have this infrastructure deficit in terms of just being able to maintain our infrastructure in the next 7 to 10 years requires $22 to $24 million based on our present knowledge. And we have the capacity of around maybe 4 million to do that. Change that to where New Brunswick now is, instead of a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, moves it to 4 or 5 as predicted in this area. We're going to be impacted dramatically, and we will not have the financial resources to meet them. We certainly don't have the financial resources to address all of the impacts of sea level rise around our coastline in New Brunswick. And then you multiply that province by province with its other vulnerabilities. So the answer is it's going to be a crunch. So you start looking at what can you do and what can't you do, knowing that I think it's not going to be a happy story. There's going to have to be trade-offs on how we live, where we live, and what resources you can actually utilize. I think we'll get through it, but I think it's going to be fundamental changes in ways that it's hard to predict, to know exactly what your day-to-day life is going to be. We're in this bubble right now, and I don't see that bubble lasting. When I think of the bubble of gas prices in New Brunswick are dipped under $1 a liter this week, and if you go to Fredericton, that's not right. Realistically, it should be $4 and $5 a liter.
Well, especially if it's going to cover the cost of the environmental harm caused producing it, right?
And there'll be a time where...
Circular economy-wise.
Yeah, we've already seen several impacts where, if you go back into the sort of the mid or late 70s, where we had the first period of time where there was questions on supply of gasoline, and we had responses from OPEC on supply, and it changed the nature. We saw for the first time compact cars. They're ugly little suckers, but they sold, and the gas guzzlers disappeared for a short period of time.
Until the gas prices fell.
And the gas prices fell, and artificially, they're depressed. Why are they artificially depressed? Because the government has supported that, because they understood that there's a whole economy that's based on that. So there's some tough times ahead in that. Europe has some really positive things that are going on and has the potential to do it because there's steps ahead. So it was very exciting for us, even in transportation, this past March, where we went to Amsterdam, but we were able to go to Rotterdam and Utrecht, but then nip over to Brussels to catch the Eurostar to get to London. And that was seamless, and it was doable, and the assumption was it's a basic service.
Well, one of the things that the Europeans have that allow that to work is population density, which actually is a good segue to asking you about one of the big global problems that we face with climate change, which is climate refugees and migration. What do you think our response in North America and in Canada could be or should be to climate refugees, and how can we be part of the solution?
Canada has a golden opportunity if it starts thinking 20, 25, and 30 for 40 years out. When we're seeing the changes in climate, where our essentially our climate systems move north, our weather patterns move north, and we have changes in the boreal forest, changes in the prairie lands, changes in wetlands versus drought-prone area. And we do have potential if we think it through and we changed our economic base. And if we invite people in ways that we have opportunities for them, as well as the people who are already here, rather than looking at refugees as being threats and using up our resources, can you mobilize the people who are already here to be the leaders and facilitators for the new opportunities? So that changes how you educate people, how you provide resources for people to be leaders in the new climate change technology or the new climate change realities.
I think that's a good introduction to my next question, which is, what do you think is missing from the discussion of climate change? Are there any other questions or better questions we should be asking ourselves?
Well, we know what's going to happen. I think we do know that. We do know what the specific climate change effects are going to be in terms of overall global temperature rise, of sea level rise, of the changes of the weather patterns, of how it's going to affect the land. We know that those are going to happen. We know that we have overpopulation on this earth. The numbers may change, but I heard and I always understood that our carrying capacity for our species is somewhere around 5.5 billion people. We're pushing 8. We're way past. Yeah. So population is a huge issue. We know that. We know what the economies are based on. We know that many of our resources are finite. We know that some of the resources we use now are not the solutions of the future. We know that there are abilities to have and produce energy in a non-polluting way. We know we have technologies. And yet we still seem to embrace political systems, political beliefs, political actions, decisions that either ignore what's going to happen, deny what's going to happen, fight against what's going to happen, or people are threatened by it. And it's not going to be a pretty period of time in the lives of our children, because these things are going to come together. And it's, if you have, I come back to, because I think I'm basically an optimist. If I come back to what Canada's opportunity is, Canada has every possibility of being the world leader of climate change and climate change decision-making and adaptation, to not only inviting refugees, but requiring, I don't want to call them refugees, because these are people, if you look in Canada, other than our Indigenous population, we were all refugees. These are people who become future Canadians. And I prefer maybe to use that term of climate change Canadians.
That's a great one, climate change Canadians.
Who can be the future of who we are. And we have the room. We have the room for millions of people. And we have the potential to make not only that they'll come, but that they'll prosper, and that their potential for changing the mitigation part, the stopping of the production of carbon dioxide or methane, the changes in the way you use energy, all of those mitigations can be part of your daily life, and you can still be incredibly enriched in your daily experience. Because what doesn't enrich me is what happens in the top of the chemical combustion chamber of my car's piston, and that doesn't. Arts and music and connections with people, those things, nature enriches me. So why look at parts of your daily life that and focus all of your attention on those things where you could change and enhance and embrace the potential to not just have a community that talks about solar cells, but talks about art and culture as part of your well-being. So you can. It doesn't have to be a bleak outlook. It can be a very exciting outlook.
What advice would you offer listeners about what they can do to be part of making a difference in meeting the challenge of the 21st century imperative?
I think that we've used the term in our own conversations around what I believe in islands of decency. And you can surround yourself and you can build community with people who share that sense of decency and connections. And then, just like in an island where the waves come in, they rebound out, and you send out reflection of those waves. And those waves affect other islands. And you have the opportunity, and Canada has the opportunity of being a huge island of decency. So it comes down to that I firmly believe that the personal action matters, that you can't give up and say, well, it's too overwhelming. I think that the local things that you can do and how you can relate to people and how you build your family and how you include those all matter. And when you look out of knowing what the world is going to do, we do simple things. If you look out the window and it's going to rain, we get an umbrella. Climate change is going to come. We need more than an umbrella, but we know what's going to happen. We know most of what we need to do. So start doing it. And I think in St. Andrews, we've started to do it. In some places, we've become local leaders. But our efforts pale in comparison to what's happening in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Europe, and other places in the world where there's some incredible innovation. And then, you look at even in the project that you're doing with this taping, or what you've done in your architectural life and what your value systems are, all of those are incredible examples of being agent of change and looking forward ahead to what are the opportunities that exist for us to live in a really wonderful world. So I guess if it comes down to don't give up hope, know that you make a difference, and it's an exciting time.
That's a good point to shift to a few hypothetical questions to bring our discussion to a close. First one, if you had a chance to return in time to visit yourself when you were first starting as a young biology teacher, what key piece of advice would you give yourself in light of what you know now about the world?
It's an interesting question. Because I think all of us, when we look back, and in my case, I'd have to look back more than 50 years, pretty well, or pretty close to 50 years, you make mistakes along the way. And some of those mistakes are totally unavoidable. Some of them are avoidable. A simple way would be, I wish I was smarter sooner.
Don't we all? But have what we have now and bring it back to all
exactly. So in some ways you're asking that kind of a question. And we've talked a little bit about this, that one of the things I've learned is that as I've grown older, the connections that you make and your ability to understand connections grows and becomes invaluable. And in my particular case, when I was first starting as a young biology teacher, I hadn't met Sylvia yet. Boy, getting the right lady makes a big difference in my life because you share value. But I mean,
But you did that, so you didn't need to offer yourself that advice.
But when you're young, you don't have that ability to make connections. So if I was going to say something to myself is value those connections. Realize that those kinds of opportunities are incredibly important. Read, learn, and happily I've been a lifelong learner. So what I know now is very different than what I knew back then. And what's also very interesting is some of the science I taught back then is wrong. And you don't know that. Peak oil, going to happen, didn't happen. Whoops, it's going to happen.
It will happen. It's just delayed.
Yeah. I probably tell them, one of the things I'd say is, look if you get the chance, buy Apple stock in Intel. But you don't know. So it's a tough question because there are some things that you can forecast. And even now, in our conversation, we can forecast certain things. How it will unfold is tricky. Who becomes important to you is often not known. So in that journey, it's tricky. So it turns out that Sylvia's been incredibly important in terms of the path that we've led together and the opportunities. So being able to decide way back in 1985 that we were going to build a house in St. Andrews, and that St. Andrews became important. I didn't know at that stage that I'd end up being mayor or that I could affect climate change or do things that affect people. So, it's an interesting question, but being open to connections, understanding what your values are, reaffirming your values, testing your values, all of those things are critical things. And I think that for the most part, I'm quite happy about where I was then and where I am now, even though I made some major mistakes along the way. So it's an interesting question, but I think it's no different than you saying to, I'm 70 years old now. What advice would I give to myself today for when I'm 80, or for anyone else to forecast? What is it that you need? What is it that you have to minimize your chances of making those mistakes? It's a good question.
Along the same lines, if you were asked to address a graduating university class of both arts and science students, what would be the advice you would give them about how to make a difference in the world?
I've given those talks, and I ran across, when I was in grade 8, I was valedictorian, and I came across recently, because I was cleaning my office, I had a copy of my valedictorian address. And it comes down to values again. A very clear examination of what your values are and how those values will impact you and your community. Because one of the things I firmly believe about values is that they're not just yours. Your values can equip you in a way that does good, but there are people who have values that equip them in a way that does irreparable harm. And all through history, you see people like that. And we certainly question Trump's values at this particular point, because some of them are in question in terms of whether they're values that will do good or values that do harm. So it's maybe looking at that, using that magnifying glass at your values, and then trying to understand, do they equip you for your life ahead? And will you consciously be able to ask yourself, are my values and my actions set at doing good, or will they harm people, and will they harm myself? And there's so many examples that you look back. I mean, the first car I bought was the Plymouth version of a Dodge Charger, 440. It went like stink. In the light of things, how much carbon dioxide I put in the atmosphere.
Not the right brand message.
At the time, I made it from Toronto to Windsor in 3 hours, less than 3 hours. I don't think I went under 100 miles an hour. Wow, what a dumb thing to do. But at the time, I didn't ask myself that question because I didn't know. So there are things that you do, but if I asked myself that question of whether that was something good to do, I may have come out with a different answer. Tricky, because there's lots that is still yet to be revealed. And again, even in climate change, how it will unfold. Yeah.
Last hypothetical question. If you were given a full page spread in the Sunday New York Times to publish any graphic or written material you wanted, what would you do with it?
I think I really would come back down to the specific forecasts for climate change, both locally and globally. Because these are pieces of science that the knowledge is pretty well tested. It may vary a little bit. So when I look across to the park, there may be slight variations in where that contour will flood, but it's going to flood. And if I had that time, I think that it's having that awareness that there's some things that are going to happen that are undeniable. And you have the opportunity as an individual to see where you are on that map or on that graph or on that climate projection, and see how it's going to affect you, and then ask that question, what are you going to do to change it?
That would be very useful. I think a lot of people would find that very effective. And finally, do you have anything you would like to request or suggest to the listeners of this podcast in helping them be better able to meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative?
As it is with me, and I think with most people, it's a personal journey. So if you're listening this far, you're already along in the personal journey. there may be something useful that I've had to say, but there's probably lots of stuff that either you already know or that you may dismiss. But the fact that you're involved in the process is, in my view, the right step, and it's an important step. So you're questioning, you're looking, you're asking where you are and how you fit in, and then hopefully you're also asking, how do the people I love and the people I connect with, how am I affecting them? Where are they in the journey? And what parts of where and how I live in my community make a difference?
Thank you. That was really wonderful.
Good.
It was a lot of fun too.
Yeah. Well, you opened the door to it, and I think there's a lot of thanks that need to be directed in your way to taking a look at this. And
for those listening, we will be putting links to some of the things that Stan mentioned in the interview in the website notes. So that wraps up this interview. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
You can find links to more information about Stan Choptiany and to notes about what we discussed in this podcast at tfcipodcast.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.